it's 4:30. You okay with me getting started? I'll make kind of a slow start with some introductions.
Yeah, I think if you
Okay.
slow roll it, we've got about half of our
Okay.
people. So slow roll it for a couple minutes. We'll be good to go.
Well, I'll make some introductions and save the good stuff for about 5 minutes from now. But hi, everybody. I'm Monica Kile with I Love the Burg. I am joined by Dex Fabian, who's behind the camera. He is the mastermind behind I Love the Burg. Also, Issa Taylor from I Love the Burg. She's managing some of the tech side of things. And then my husband, John Kile, is in charge of the great photos that you're going to be seeing today. He'll be toggling between me live here on the street on Central Avenue and some great historic photos that'll enrich our tour today. So I spend a lot of time at the cafe behind us, Craft Cafe, and I was sitting there one day thinking about how for many years I led an 8-hour historic tour of the city for a leadership group in town. And I was sitting at Craft one day and I thought, you really can learn everything you need to know about St. Pete history in about half an hour by strolling between 2nd Street and 6th Street on Central Avenue. And so I talked to Dex and we came up with this idea of doing St. Pete history via Central, probably less than 40 minutes. I can tell you everything you really need to know to understand the history of St. Pete right here along Central Avenue, our most interesting street, in my opinion. So that's what we're going to do today. And we're going to mix between me standing here pointing out some of the cool old buildings and some great historic photos that'll help illustrate our point. So hopefully at the end of this 40 minutes or so, you'll know as much as somebody like me that has a master's degree in Florida history. So that's what we're going to be doing today. And we're starting here, as I mentioned, right in front of Craft Cafe, because really it's here that the city really got its start with the Orange Belt Railroad. And John's going to put up a picture of one of the locomotives from the Orange Belt Railroad. That is the train that was brought here to St. Pete, what was then called Wardsville, just a tiny little hamlet of about 7 buildings on the Pinellas Peninsula. The Orange Belt Railroad was brought here by a man named Peter Demens, or Pyotr Dementia, the crazy Russian, as they sometimes like to refer to him. He was an exile from outside of St. Petersburg, Russia, who had been exiled. He was loosely implicated in the plot to kill the Tsar. And he had come to own a railroad in Longwood, Florida. And he was looking for a place on the Pinellas Peninsula to bring his railroad, a place that he could have access to deep water so the ships could, load and unload freight. He couldn't quite strike the deal that he wanted on the open Gulf, and he ended up purchasing land from a man named John Williams, who owned about 1,600 acres of land here in what is now downtown St. Petersburg, Florida. Basically everything east of Tropicana Fields is owned by John Williams. The two men met, they closed the deal, and on June 8, 1888, Peter Demens brought his Orange Belt Railroad into town. It had one lone passenger on the train, a shoe salesman from Savannah, who took one look at the dismal prospects in town and got right back on the train and headed back to Savannah the next day. But St. Petersburg was born. Peter Demens named the town after his hometown of St. Petersburg, Russia. John Williams wasn't happy about that, but we'll get to that in a second. And the first train pulled into about where Tropicana Field is now, but very shortly thereafter, Peter Demens built a passenger depot about in the location where I'm standing now, on the corner of Central Avenue and 2nd Street. John has a picture of the passenger depot. And you'll notice it has this sort of ornate Russian style. That was a nod to Peter Demens' Russian heritage. So all of the Orange Belt Railroad's train stations throughout Florida had that Russian look to them. He also used that on the Grand Hotel that he built as part of his deal with John Williams. He agreed that he would build a hotel to help spur development in the city. You can see that hotel in the kind of in the background of the picture of the passenger depot. That hotel, Peter Demens named the Detroit Hotel after John Williams's hometown of Detroit, Michigan. So Williams didn't get to name the town, but he did get at least the hotel named after him. The cool thing is, while the passenger depot has long since been demolished for this big tower that I still think of as the Bank of America Tower, the Detroit Hotel is still standing. John, pull up that old picture of the Detroit Hotel. And I want people to take a good look at that while I kind of shift over here So you can see what still remains of the Detroit Hotel. Now, John, once they've had a chance to look at that picture, go ahead and make me big. And I'm going to show you. It's hard to see it. Now, if you look just at that picture and you've been in St. Pete for a while, it might be hard to realize that that building is still standing, but it is. And I'm going to show you how to recognize it. So that historic wooden building that you saw in that picture was a Queen Anne style Victorian building. Doesn't look quite the same today, but if you'll remember, there was that big tall tower on the right side of the picture. You can still see that tower there today. Now, that is not the original tower. The original tower was taller than this. It was about 70 feet tall, and it was demolished when one of the brick additions was added. But they reconstructed it in 2002 when the building was turned into condominiums. The middle portion of the building, that yellow portion, is the original wooden portion of the building that's just been covered over in stucco. The brick additions were added later. So the wooden building was built in 1888. The brick additions were added at two different times. So the left or westernmost addition was added in 1910, and the right or easternmost addition was added in 1914, at which time they demolished the tower. You can actually tell that the brick additions were added at different times if we zoom in, if you're able to, Dex. I know sometimes it gets tricky. If you zoom in on the windows on the left brick addition, if you look right above the windows, almost what I would call an eyebrow. It's called a lintel in architectural terms, but the lintel on these windows is made out of brick, and it has a marble keystone in the center. And then the window sills underneath the window are made out of granite. If you look to the addition on the right, or the easternmost side, you'll see that the lintels and the sill are both made out of concrete, probably a cheaper option a few years later. So just kind of a hint that those additions were not placed there at the same time. So you'll also notice, if you can go back for a second, John, to the original picture, the original building had a two-story balcony. That second-story balcony was removed at probably the same time the tower was removed when they added the brick additions. It does still have the one-story tower. So when this was converted into condominiums in 2002, they restored the tower, brought that back. And while it looks quite a bit different, you can still see the bones. And it is certainly our most historic building in town still today. In September, some of you may have seen some kind of exciting news. They uncovered the original elevator from the Detroit Hotel. It was all over Facebook, and the Times did a story on it. The elevator, and John's going to put up a picture of that, was one of the earliest elevators, probably the earliest elevator in any building on the west coast of Florida, and they really used this to promote the hotel. So it leads us into the next point I want to make about this hotel and its importance in St. Pete history. It's really the earliest example we have of promoting tourism, which almost since the beginning of the city's founding was our leading industry. So immediately after Peter Demens built the hotel, he starts advertising things like the hotel, that he's got the hotel, or like the elevator. He's got the elevator, come to this hotel rather than somewhere else where you're gonna have to walk up the stairs. He also advertises things like the toboggan that he's added to the railroad pier. So when he built the railroad, they built a long pier out into the water at what is now what we know as Demon's Landing. It's where the original pier was, not in the location that we think of the pier being today, several blocks south. But Peter Demens added a big toboggan slide that you could slide down off of. John will point it out with his cursor in the picture there. So imagine, sliding down this toboggan slide and off into the water while you've got trains kind of running down beside you. Quite a thrill. But the promotions would advertise things like the toboggan slide. They would advertise excursions like to go fishing or to go turtling, because turtle soup was a popular item on the menu in those days. So you would catch your turtles and you would eat them at your meal that night. So very early on, we were engaging in really heavy promotion of St. Pete as a place of leisure. And interestingly, we think of tourists coming today as coming in the winter, with this great weather we've got today, for instance. But our earliest tourists were actually coming in the summer. They were promoting St. Pete as really a way to beat the heat. You've got these stifling temperatures inland. and you could get on a train, take a short ride out to St. Pete and get these cool breezes. So the Detroit Hotel really is a great example of the path that we're going to be on really for the rest of our existence as a city. We're going to walk down to about 2 blocks, and as we do, I'll have Dex film the rest of this block as well. The rest of this block we call the first block because it's really the first original block in the city, and all of these buildings that you see are all early 1900s buildings, and some of the only remaining 1910s, 19-teens building that we have in the city. We have 1903, 1907, even this portion, and we'll start walking, Dex, even the more western portion of the block that has where the building all looks kind of similar. It has the same facade on it and this copper canopy that's been added. Those are actually all original 1910s buildings as well that have been covered over in stucco and the canopy added to make them all look the same. The back side of this block has more early 1900s buildings. So it's really the most historic and intact block that we have in the city of St. Petersburg. And it is under threat from development. As St. Pete grows in popularity, people want to tear these buildings down and put up taller ones. As we walk, John is going to show some early pictures of Central Avenue and some of the other buildings that we had. There we go. So that's a quick glimpse of one of the shops along Central. Keep going, John. And that's inside, I believe that's John Williams' son's store along Central Avenue, which is kind of a sundry shop. There's an early hotel. And this, I love this picture because this shows where we were just standing in the kind of in the back part of this picture. There used to be a huge dip on Central Avenue in between 2nd and 3rd Streets, and it would fill with water during rainy weather. And they called it, locals called it the swale, and they would avoid it. You can see it in this picture. People would avoid it during rainy weather because it would ruin their shoes and their dresses. So really not until the swale was filled in the early 1900s did this part of Central become kind of the central business district. Go ahead to the next picture, John. Just another, that's I think about 1913, that picture of Central Avenue. We used to have a streetcar line there. I think that must be the last of the, so John, go ahead and if that's the last historic picture we have, go ahead and make me big. I want Dex to show the parking. So Dex, over here and show, so the block that we're walking on now on the north side of the street is occupied by the parking garage for the city's, we're gonna go to this, stop right down here, Dex. The parking garage to the city building. So this building that Dex is filming right now, it's called the Municipal Services Center, or the MSC building for short. And I'm gonna talk about that again in just a minute, but we're gonna walk up here to the corner of 4th Street and Central, which has always been one of the most important intersections in our city. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and about why that is. I'm going to step right here, and we're going to hope that these ambulances don't cause a problem. So we talked about the city's founding in 1888. The next couple of decades are really prosperous ones for St. Petersburg. We're promoting the city heavily as a place for leisure and recreation, and people are starting to come. We have a small real estate boom in the 19-teens as the city is expanding westward towards the beaches. But the next period that's really important to know about St. Petersburg history is the great boom of the 1920s. And this boom happens not just in St. Pete, but all of Florida booms during the decade of the 1920s. We are engaging in heavy promotion all across the state. This is a time of great social change in the United States. We've just come out of World War I, a terrible war. People are disillusioned. There's been real changes, social changes in people's work and things like pensions and vacations all of a sudden. Workers are getting rights that they never had before. There's been a huge influx in domestic spending after the war. So we have huge improvements in things like roads. The Model T is sweeping the nation. So now all of a sudden people have the means, the time, and the ability to travel. And they want to exercise it. They've just come out of a terrible war. They're disillusioned. They want a little taste of the good life. And boy, does Florida respond. During 1 year of the 1920s, AAA reports that there's more requests for maps to St. Petersburg, Florida than anywhere else in the United States. So St. Pete and everywhere else is really pushing the good life. And we have a huge, not just population boom, but real estate boom as well. So the decade of the 1920s saw our population go from 14,000 to 40,000 people. And they're coming first down to visit, and then they're buying and they're staying. And when they come to visit, we recognize really quickly that we don't have enough hotel space. So there's a huge boom in hotel buildings. One of those, we had 10 large masonry hotels that are built in the city during the decade of the 1920s. And one of those is just over my shoulder here, the tall brick building behind me, if you can kind of focus in on that, Dex. That's called the Princess Martha, originally called the Mason Hotel. And then a couple years later changed into the Princess Martha. And that's one of 10 hotels. John, put up that slide with the other 10 boom era hotels. Places like the Vinoy, which is still standing. The Don Cesar, which is still standing. And both of those are still operating as hotels. The Pennsylvania, which is now the Courtyard Marriott downtown, is one of the 10 boom era hotels. We've lost several of them to demolition. The Sereno was demolished. The File building, which we'll talk about a little later, was demolished. And a lot of those big boom era hotels have been converted into schools. So Stetson College, for instance, was the Roliat Hotel, which is Taylor spelled backwards. That was the builder of the hotel. Admiral Farragut School out in the Jungle area. That was a grand hotel, the Jungle Hotel as well. So we get all these hotels. People are coming down to visit. They're coming to stay. And they're being lured here by, again, this heavy promotion that we're engaging in. Newspaper articles, magazine articles are being written about St. Petersburg. Postcards are being sent all over the country. And they're displaying things like the open air post office, if you could focus in on that for a second there, Dex. This unusual, has to be the most unusual post office in the United States, built in 1917 and built specifically to take advantage of this great weather we have. You can access your post office box at any time of the day or night, really in any weather, because the weather just never gets that bad here in St. Pete. The original design for this post office was your sort of traditional classical style building with big stairs that went up into this big kind of imposing building. And the postmaster said, that doesn't fit St. Pete. We don't want that. And he sketched pretty much on the back of an envelope a building modeled after a hospital in Florence. And I should have included pictures of that because it looks identical to it. It's really a fabulous recreation of this hospital, Della Innocente in Florence, Italy. And so he built the open air post office. And you know what? We're not above promoting anything. We're slapping that on postcards. John, put that postcard up where it says, I think, something to the effect of the only one of its kind in the U.S. So we're promoting anything we can. And St. Pete is really booming during this time because of this type of heavy promotion. So it's this economic and population boom into which the Snell Arcade behind us is born. And this is really, I think, the most spectacular building in St. Petersburg. It's built in 1928, just before the country enters the Great Depression. So it's really the last hurrah for our building boom. And what a hurrah it is. It's from the second story up, it's a glazed terracotta on the outside. The bottom, the ground floor, is made out of Florida keystone. It has this lovely copper canopy that goes around the building. Interestingly, the copper canopy did not originally cover the entire corner. The front entrance didn't have, that canopy did not extend over the front entrance. When Walgreens took over the building in the 1950s, they extended the canopy, I think, because they wanted their patrons covered when they were walking inside. But originally, the entrance into this building was this beautiful arched entryway. We have a picture of the opposite side of the arcade still has that beautiful arched entryway. So this is an arcade in the traditional classical architectural sense, in that it's a covered walkway in the middle there. I don't know if you can read the sign that says Green Bench Flowers. but that leads into a covered hallway with shops on either side. And if you come out the back side of that hallway into the alley, you'll see how, has John put up that picture of the archway? So
Yep.
that beautiful arch is what you would have seen on the front as well. When you enter into the arcade itself, the building was built by a man named Perry Snell, who over the 40 years that he lived in St. Pete developed really many of the most beautiful neighborhoods that we have. He developed Mirror Lake, the Old Northeast, Granada Terrace, Snell Isle. He was a man that really believed in things of beauty, and he loved Italian art and French art. So he filled this building chock full of really, I mean, there's 30 different tiles in the arcade itself. John, put that picture up that shows the inside of the arcade, and you can get a glimpse of some of the tile there. If you look on the ground in that picture, you'll see kind of square, what look like, lit up tiles. Those aren't tiles. That actually speaks to another interesting part about this building, in that it has a basement, which of course is very rare in Florida. And a story that happened during construction will tell you why. When they were digging the basement, they hit a spring and had a major construction disaster, had to get everybody out of bed at 3 a.m. to plug up the leak. But it does indeed have a basement. Those squares you see on the ground are actually lights. They're skylights essentially into the basement. You'll find those same square blocks on the sidewalk outside of the Snell Arcade when you're walking by, and those are lights down into the basement, so you can impress your friends with that bit of trivia next time you walk by. Much of that beautiful arcade you're seeing in the picture was covered over during the 50s and 60s. So think a lot of carpet and stucco covering up all this beautiful tile. There's a great mosaic, John, if you go to that picture. There was originally two tile mosaics that adorned the upper walls high up in the arcade that were removed and then covered over during the dark period, I'll call it, of the 50s and 60s. When the renovation took place in the 80s, they found that mosaic in storage and were able to restore it. We don't know what happened, or at least I don't know what happened to the other one. And the space remains empty where the sort of matching mosaic would have been. The Snell Arcade underwent a beautiful, really impeccable restoration in the 1980s and has been designated both a local historic landmark and a national historic landmark, which the local historic landmark designation mandates that exterior changes that are made to it have to be in keeping with its original historic character. So they've really done just a fabulous job on the Snell Arcade. So before we move on to the next block here, I want Dex to just come a little bit this way again and point out the MSC building one more time. Try and get a good shot of that, because we're going to come back to that and talk about that when we get down to our next corner. As we leave this corner, I want to talk again about the importance of the corner here at 4th Street and Central Avenue. Has always been really a center of the city. John, show that early picture of the picnic that was taken just a couple of years after the city was founded. There was a big gathering here. This was a place that people came and gathered. Just a few years after that photo was taken, the corner was bought by a man named Noel Mitchell, who was a entrepreneur. He had made quite a bit of money selling saltwater taffy on the Jersey Shore. I think we have a picture of one of his advertisements. And came to St. Pete and started buying and selling real estate. He bought the corner and built his real estate office there, called it, what else? Mitchell's Corner. He named it. We have a picture of that as well. And he inadvertently started one of the things that St. Pete is probably most famous for. He could not get people to come down. They considered Mitchell's Corner, 4th Street, to be really too far from kind of the center of downtown, down where the Detroit was. And he couldn't get people to walk down to see him. So he put some benches outside of his office thinking, well, if I give them a place to sit and relax, maybe they'll walk down here. Promoter that he was, he splashed some advertisements on the benches and people liked them. They did come down and they sat on them. other businesses took note and began doing the same thing. So they had benches outside of their office, painted different colors, different advertisements on those, until eventually we had so many benches of different sizes and shapes and colors that the mayor at the time, Al Lang, said, this is ridiculous. We have to make these all look the same. And he passed what he called the Green Ordinance, where he mandated that all the benches be the same size, shape, and color. They picked a hunter green. They could have advertising on them, but it had to be the same standard block lettering, as you can see in the photo that John should be putting up now. So these benches grew in popularity until at one point we had 6,000 green benches lining the streets of St. Petersburg. And they became a real symbol of hospitality. So again, they were promoted in magazines, postcards. Everybody knew about the green benches of St. Petersburg and that they were a symbol of hospitality. They weren't, however, a symbol of hospitality to everyone equally. African Americans were not allowed to sit on the green benches of St. Petersburg, unless perhaps they were taking care of white children. But even then, most probably wouldn't. You can see, I think many people don't realize what a Jim Crow city St. Petersburg was and what a Jim Crow state Florida was. But we had very strict segregation laws here in St. Petersburg. Interestingly enough, Blacks were allowed to come downtown and shop. They could certainly come downtown and spend their money, but they were not, as you can see with the two women shopping downtown, they were not, however, allowed to try on the clothes if they went downtown to shop. They certainly weren't allowed to return them. They couldn't drink from a water fountain if they got thirsty. They couldn't eat at a restaurant, and they certainly couldn't sit on the green benches. There's tons of pictures of the green benches. I have yet to see one with a Black person sitting on the benches. But I have found these pictures that you can see in the next photo John will show you. Lots of white people and a Black man with a hat, probably a chauffeur, standing around waiting for his passenger, notably not sitting on the green benches. So they weren't a symbol of hospitality for everyone, and still, I think, strike quite a painful note when the green benches are promoted unthinkingly, I think, by a lot of people here in St. Petersburg. So those also started on the corner of 4th Street and Central. We are now at the corner of 5th Street and Central, and behind me is the Crest building. As we were walking down here, we also passed a McCrory's. So Crest and McCrory's, and then Woolworth just down the way, were 5 and dime or variety stores that were very popular in St. Pete. So this is where you would come and get your knickknacks, your candies, whatever it was you needed. Crest actually kept architects on staff to design their many 5 and dimes throughout the country. This one shares that same glazed terracotta that the Snell Arcade has. Really a beautiful building. Behind me, I'm going to have Dex turn around here. We have what appears to be, and many people think, is a lovely park here in the city, an enclosed park. In fact, it is a privately owned lot that is soon to be home to the tallest building in St. Petersburg. I think John will be putting up a picture of that. And there's a story behind the buildings that were here. John, I think it's the next, John, you can hear me, right? Is the next picture the one of the file?
Let's see.
Or is it the MSC building again?
It's the file in the Central National.
Okay, so the buildings that were standing in this location until about 5 years ago were known as the File Hotel, one of those big 10 boom era hotels that we talked about, and the Central National Bank, 2 lovely buildings that you can see in the picture on your screen. Those were demolished about 5 years ago. If you've lived here for any period of time and those buildings don't look familiar to you, it's because they were covered in a metal skin in the 1960s. John, go ahead and put that picture up. People called this the cheese grater. So if you've lived here any time, that building will probably look a lot more familiar to you. It was right across from the Snell Arcade. But hiding under that cheese grater skin were these 2 lovely buildings. And remember, I showed you the MSC building, the Municipal Services Center, a little bit earlier. John, throw up a picture for them so they can see that again. That too is a skin that was added in the 1960s. And underneath it also are historic buildings. So John, go ahead and show that next picture that shows, I believe it was the first federal bank, is that tall building. They then added something to the building next door and enclosed the whole thing in a skin. And that story brings us to the next era that I want to talk about in St. Pete's history. We had the decade of the 1920s when we boomed. The city, like the rest of the country, then enters into the Great Depression. And then we come out of that like everyone else does with World War II. And following World War II, we have another pretty spectacular boom. We have an 87% increase in the city's population during the decade of the 1950s, which sounds great, but that boom ended up spelling the ringing the death knell for downtown St. Petersburg, because along with that increase in population and the advent of air conditioning, everybody has cars now. We begin building things like shopping centers on the outskirts of town and eventually the shopping mall, and that kills downtown's retail scene. Meanwhile, those big boom era hotels and the many tourist apartments that were smaller, almost homes that people would come stay in, they're now beginning to suffer from a lack of deferred maintenance. We've got 30, 40 years growing on these hotels. They didn't have air conditioning. They weren't kept up. And now all of a sudden, many of those hotels are becoming essentially low rent boarding houses, which is perfect for elderly people on a fixed income. So suddenly St. Pete is starting to look pretty old, both in our buildings and in our population. And the city really wants to change this image because now we're becoming the brunt of late night comics jokes. Johnny Carson is saying things like, it's the world's largest above ground cemetery. We're known as God's waiting room, land of the newlywed and the nearly dead. There was an article written, actually it's from the 1920s, but it talked about how, if you believed the things that were only the things that were written about in the newspaper articles or the magazine articles you read about St. Pete, it'd be easy to think that St. Pete was filled with nothing but young bathing beauties in their 20s, because we're always splashing them everywhere, and their grandparents, because that's all you really ever saw was young, beautiful women in their 20s prancing around in bathing suits. And these old people sitting on the corners, sitting on the green benches, sort of watching the world go by. And it becomes this image that St. Pete really is desperate to shake. And downtown becomes moribund. If you lived here in the 70s, 80s, or 90s, you'll know it was like a ghost town in downtown. So the city is trying to do everything it can to shake that image. They take out the green benches in the late 1960s. They start adding these skins to our buildings to try and modernize them. They tear down the famous $1 million pier that was built in the 1920s and replace it with a much more modern inverted pyramid. So it's all these efforts, and really none of it works. These skins make the buildings look worse. People don't respond to the efforts that they're making downtown. And we really go through a period of what I would call the doldrums. So that's what happened to the buildings that were here. The File and the Central National Bank sat empty for many, many years. Eventually, through sort of a convoluted process, that building was sold and unfortunately demolished. Preservationists made a valiant effort to save these buildings, but they were demolished. And soon the tallest building in the city will go here and replace them. So we're going to move up to our next stop.
Monica, did you want me to share those pictures of the skin coming off?
Oh, yes. Thank you, John. Yeah, when they tore down the File in the Central National Bank, we caught some pictures. First, they removed the skin, and you can see that the File, which is the taller building, was really still in quite good shape. Somebody had actually, if you'll notice, there's big black letters written on the building. Somebody had actually gotten up there and spray painted, graffitied it at some point before, we don't know when, but at some point before the skin was taken off and it was torn down. And then you can see the name of the File Hotel that was above one of the doorways in the other photo. So it was a sad day when those went down. We're gonna walk up and stop in just half a block here at one of my favorite things about St. Pete is these ghost murals that we have everywhere. And actually, I got most of my information from this next little bit from an I Love the Burg story that I think Brian maybe wrote years ago. You can just now see, Dex, those signs up there. We're approaching them. when this bank that is immediately next to me, the Regions Bank, was built maybe 10 years ago, they demolished the buildings that were originally in this place. They built a new bank and then left this portion of it for parking. So there was no longer a building adjoining this one. And when they tore that building down, they revealed what we now call ghost murals. So basically signs that were painted on the wall that had been there since the 1920s. They didn't look this good. They have since been restored, and you can see down in the corner it says mural restored by the Hubert Rutland Senior Family Trust in September of 2012. But it's fun to learn the stories of these businesses. The top one, Ermatinger's Exclusive Hatters. They were some of the most well-known hat restorers in Florida. They also sold Ecuadorian and Panamanian hats, but they were very well known. In fact, the senior Ermatinger won a $500 prize in like the 1920s for the best scientific techniques of hat restoration. Hayward's Toy Shop was famous for carrying Mavis candy, and they would get new shipments of games every day. And then Wisteria Confectionery, which is the bottom one, would host tea parties and wedding receptions and all kinds of social functions. So it was always in the newspaper. So it's sort of fun to imagine that all those businesses were in those buildings, and those murals have been lovingly restored. You see that periodically because we have so many places where facades were put over buildings. When those facades are torn down, we uncover these great ghost murals. Across the street here is one of my other favorite buildings in St. Pete, the Alexander Hotel, which was built by a famous architect out of Atlanta. He's particularly prominent in Atlanta, named Neil Reed. This was built in, I believe, 1919, and it's a neoclassical revival style building. One of the only examples of that we have here in St. Pete. It's a beautiful building. We're going to walk down to 6th Street, where we're going to finish up with what I think is really the coolest block in St. Pete. As we're walking, the building next to the Alexander, which is this kind of yellow buff brick building, looking a little rough right now. Many of us will remember it as the Dome Grill for many years, a place you could go and get breakfast. That was originally the Woolworths. John has a picture of that he can show as well. And of course, we just recently lost Whig Villa on the corner, which I think everybody sort of realized that Central Avenue is definitely changing when we lost Whig Villa, which was here on the corner for many, many years. So as we approach the light here and John, go ahead and make us big again. I want Dex to film this parking lot here to my left where the Bank of America building is. There's a drive-through. And then there's also a parking lot across the street. Those were the locations of two grand theaters, the La Plaza Theater and the Florida Theater. The Florida Theater was here, the one immediately to my left, and then La Plaza across the street. The Florida Theater was huge, and John, you've got to go ahead and put that picture up of it. Had 2,300 seats, and this is where Elvis played. There you go. That's the Florida Theater. And then, so Elvis played there in the 1950s. And then the La Plaza Theater was directly across the street from it. It was the largest stage south of Atlanta. And the La Plaza Theater was built by George Gandy. So again, sort of victims of these changing tastes of the late 1950s and early 1960s when they were demolished. And now our parking lot. So, really a great example of paving paradise to put up a parking lot. If you've ever been to the Tampa Theater in St. Pete, it was very similar. The Florida Theater was very similar to the Tampa Theater in St. Pete. And don't we wish we had that here in St. Pete today? When we get a chance, so before we cross the street, Dex, I want you to film this block here. So this is what is known as the 600 block or the Chryslip block or the Chryslip Arcade, named for the building here in the middle, this sort of yellow brick building. This entire block was slated for demolition during our last real estate boom that went bust in 2008. So it was purchased in 2006. It was at that time kind of full of thrift store, sort of flea market-y type of establishments. Developer bought it, moved everyone out, and the entire block was slated for demolition to build the 30-story condominium. The boom went bust. That developer lost his shirt. He sold it to somebody else that had no immediate plans to build. An enterprising city councilwoman named Leslie Curran, who owned an art gallery herself, convinced that developer to kind of turn it over to artists for sort of an artist colony. And those artists put in a lot of sweat equity. John, show that early picture of the Crystal Arcade when it's still looking pretty run down. Those artists put in a lot of sweat equity and turned a lot of these spaces into usable gallery shop spaces, and they restored the arcade itself. So you can see they put this great iron grill work on it. We're going to go over there in just a second. But they turned it into really the most vibrant block along Central Avenue. If you ever come out on a second Saturday art walk, for instance, this place is just hopping. And the great thing about it is that it's all really local shops. We're going to go ahead and cross the street and walk through the Crystal Arcade and come out to the back side. What I love about it is that it really illustrates, I talked about during the 70s, 80s, 90s, we were kind of trying to remake ourselves as a city and really change who we were. And it didn't work. And I think what has really worked to make St. Pete such a cool, desirable, hip place is that we have embraced who we are. And this really is who we are. This arcade was one of 10 arcades. We talked about the Snell Arcade earlier, this covered walkway with shops on either side. So we had 10 of these at one point. We have 3 remaining today, but the Crystal Arcade was one of them. And this is who we were, right? Before we had air conditioning, this is a great way to facilitate airflow through a space. Shoppers would be comfortable, they would enjoy themselves. So we brought that back. We've kind of grabbed onto and embraced who we were. We embraced things like shuffleboard, which for so many years was, your grandmother's sport and sort of made fun of as a sport for old people. Now our shuffleboard club is once again over 1,000 members and one of the most popular things to do on a Friday night. We've embraced our buildings like the Snell Arcade and like the Crystal Arcade and this block, and really focused on shopping local and embracing our shop owners and our artists. And that's where we'll finish up actually on the backside. And you can see these great stores that are in here now. There's a new coffee shop that I haven't yet tried, but I make it my business to try every coffee shop in town. And the fun thing about the Crystal Arcade and the 600 block is that when you come out the back side of the arcade, you're equally rewarded as you were on the front side, because we have some of the best art in the city. You'll see this mural here. Many of you may know that we have, gosh, there must be hundreds of murals at this point all over the city of St. Petersburg. And that trend really started here on the back of what was at the time Chad Mize's art gallery. And he painted, it may have been this one, this Twiggy mural. He's also got Mr. Sun. That was one of the promotional tools that we used in the 1920s. He began painting these murals on the back of the building. Other artists followed suit. And eventually now we have the Great Shine Mural Festival. So we've really in St. Pete embraced who we are. We are artists. We are shop owners. We are a place that celebrates leisure and the sunshine. And that has really been the key to our success. So all these attempts that we made in the 60s and 70s and 80s to be somebody else didn't work. And the minute we kind of embraced who we were, we blossomed. And now, of course, St. Pete is just one of the greatest cities. You hear it all the time. Everybody says, I love the Burg. And Dex was really on to something over 10 years ago when he named his blog that, I Love the Burg, because people really do. And I hope that you have now more reason to love the Burg, and that you can go and impress all your friends with everything you know about St. Pete history that you learned in just 30 minutes. We talked about the city's founding in 1888, Peter Demons and John Williams, the city founders, and the Orange Belt Railroad, and the Detroit Hotel, the boom of the 1920s, and our boom era hotels, our promotional history, our boom of the 1950s with our 87% increase in population, the lull of the 60s, 70s, and 80s when we got those ugly skins on buildings and became the brunt of the late night jokes, and then our renaissance that we've entered into in the last couple of decades. So really, for all those people that took my 8-hour bus tour, I'm sorry. I could have done it all in half an hour. So count yourselves lucky that you got the 30-minute illustrated version with pictures. Thank you to Isa and Dex and John for their contributions. If you enjoyed the tour, let us know. Make sure to subscribe to I Love the Burg, and we'll be doing more fun history things like this. See you soon. Thanks. Bye.